The back says, now what does it say? Something about change. Maybe I can turn around and you can see the back.
Okay. Yeah, you have to get down and boogie.
Can you see what it
Almost,
says?
I can see something with change, but I can't see the top word. Damn it. Oh, growing with change.
Yeah, that's it. Growing with change.
I love it.
Which is what we're talking about, sort of.
Yeah. Thank you. So, my name is April Sampson Kelly, and I want to thank you for talking with me today, Stuart Hill. I'm really puzzled about systems thinking. Last weekend, I went to a party, and there was a guy who proudly showed me his enclosure, very nice enclosure. I said, "Oh, wow, what are you going to put in your enclosure?" And he goes, "A permaculture garden." I'm wondering about our image, permaculture image. I fear that people are seeing the bits, the elements within a design, and then they're thinking that that is permaculture. I remember in the 80s, water tanks and mulching was really big on the party agendas. And I just don't know, is it a matter of time? Will the young people be able to understand it better? That it's actually about design. What do you think?
Well, when you said that, my mind went to Jung's concept of us being different personality types. And so there are sort of mainly four preferences, which is people who are interested in the big picture and ideas, and people who are interested in the practical things of how do you do things, and then people who are interested in the feelings associated with it, and then people who are interested in the sort of organization and control and so forth. And so depending on what those are, and Jung thought that we're actually born with these, and you might sort of develop a little bit more openness to the others, but you have a core sort of preference, which is subconscious. So for different people, it means completely different things. Although they may be having conversations that look like they're talking about the same thing, but deep down inside them, they're talking about very different things.
Wow.
If you narrow those down, it's to sensing and intuiting and thinking and feeling. Those are the sort of labels they use. And I know when I used to teach, I'm an intuitive feeling person in my preferences. So although I'm an academic, I'm not a sensing, which is an organizing and practical sort of person, and a thinking person. People assume, if you're an academic, you're going to be thinking. But that's not my preference. And it doesn't mean when something isn't your preference, it doesn't mean you're not good at it. It just means that you do it in the service of what your preference is. So if you want people to develop competences in permaculture, it's really important to first find out what their preferences are. And if you're teaching them, to teach them in the service of what their preferences are. So I know when I used to teach social ecology, in the first class, I would spend part of the time talking practically, part of the time talking about ideas, part of the time talking about my feelings, and part of the time talking about my thinking and the logic of what I'm talking about. And all the students, because they got spoken to, thought, oh, he's talking to me. Whereas a lot of people, when they teach, they just teach their preference. And so all the people in the class who are not identified with the preference of the teacher are subconsciously feeling, I don't know if this is going to work for me. This may not be helpful. And it was interesting that even just doing that once, very consciously in the first class, that enabled those students to hang in for the whole semester, feeling that I was talking to them because I'd actually anchored our connection first off. And I think it applies to, you know, the question, what is permaculture and what is systems? It depends on those preferences, how you would define it.
Could you give me an example of that, please?
Well, I mean, the joke one is the definition of kissing, you know, and for a microbiologist, it's the exchange of thousands of microorganisms, and for the biologist or the anatomist, they might say it's sucking through a 30-foot long tube. So the way we understand the world can be very different, and you notice this when you take a group of people out into the country and you say, you know, what did you notice? And they all notice completely different things. That's, you know, gives away what their preferences are. I used to teach entomology. I would say to my students, we're going into the field to look at insects in a pond. And there's another aspect of that difference, and it's based on Myers-Briggs analysis of it. And they distinguish between P people and J people. And J people are organized, and P people are much more creative. And so as an artist, a lot of artists are P people, whereas J people are their partners who go and do the shopping to enable them to be creative. And so my J people would be lined up asking me questions. How long are we going to be? What do we need to take? What are we going to look at? And all my P people would be out the door and off on the way to the field. So these differences are really, really important to understand when we're teaching something. And the same with design. So like what's a good design? So for an intuitive person, it's a very creative design. For a sensing person, it's going to be practical. So the idea of, you know, having the herbs near the kitchen door is a very important thing for a sensing person. And for a feeling person, it's particularly the aesthetics of it, and just imagining the joy of going into this area each day. And then for a thinking person, it's, you know, much more the logic of the relationships between the different components of the system and how they work together to, for example, companion planting might repel insects, or other things might provide decomposition materials to nurture the plants and so forth. So that's, and what comes out of that is, if you're actually working to design a large operation, it's best to have a group of people with those diversities of preferences collaborating, because one will say, oh, we should do this. oh, and the other might say, oh, that would be good. I wonder if we can also incorporate so-and-so. And then another one would want to incorporate something else. And that collaborative design would be so much more sustainable and meaningful and effective and so forth for a greater group of people than a design based on an individual.
My only objection to that, I'm just showing weakness now, is that sometimes when I can see a big picture and I can see the logics of something, I want to explore that. And when I have people with me who don't even really understand the project, they often succumb to details and get trapped and pull me into those details. And I'm constantly having to rise above that. I don't mean that in a, I'll have to cut that out. I don't mean that in a, that I'm superior. I just mean that I'm trying to do a big picture overview and they immediately jump to details.
Right. Which in a way gives away their preference. They would be typically, people who want to know details will often be sensing and J people who want that assuredness about it. But that's why I think it's really, really important before one does any teaching to do some sort of grassroots psychotherapy and helping people to learn how to listen and how to collaborate and to also share before you get into anything. What are you most interested? What are you each most interested in? So they can get that off their chest, because if they don't get that off their chest throughout the whole of the teaching process, they're going to be subconsciously sort of driven to try and make their interest known to the teacher. And so by finding out what they're interested in at the beginning and then teaching them how to listen. And you can do that by having people in pairs, learning about one another. In 5 minutes, tell your personal story with one another. And as the listener, to primarily listen, but also be open to thinking, to ask some questions that really shows that they're actually listening, not just getting through the exercise. And even if the only thing they say is, could you tell me more about that? That's a really powerful thing to do in the whole process. Once you've got some of those things out of the way, you can then say, these are some of the things I'm going to be covering. So if you explain also that you're actually going to be covering the details, but not straight away, if your preference, and I suspect your preference will be the creative visioning and designing, you'd want to be sharing that creative and passionate sort of aspect. Well, for the person who wants to do the practical thing, they're going to sit there thinking, oh, we need to get to how we do this and so forth. Well, if you've already told them, actually in the second class or the fourth class or later in the morning, you're going to be covering those particular details, they can not be so anxious. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of psychology involved in this sort of teaching process, which generally gets ignored in our teaching and learning systems, including in permaculture, which was why many years ago I attended one of the first big permaculture conferences in America. And I was sort of concerned, I suppose, that it wasn't, in my mind, working. And so I came up with this concept of the need for a permaculture of the inner landscape before you started dealing with the permaculture of the outer landscape. And I think that's still not fully appreciated in permaculture. It's there are some people who've interested in it, like yourself, but there's a lot of people who say, "Oh no, that we don't want to deal with that sort of fluffy stuff. Let's get on with the design," you know.
Well, maybe it's taken me 25 years. I don't know. Maybe I'm starting to now want to know about the inner landscape. What would you like to tell me about this permaculture of the inner landscape?
All of us, particularly in industrialized countries, because of the whole emphasis on control of what happens to children, and has a long history of control, which has got slightly less brutal, but you know, historically you could look back to children being very, at the most, tolerated. If you look at Elizabethan England, children didn't actually eat with their parents. They ate after their parents had eaten, as a dominant sort of approach. And quite often the children were in a serving role, bringing food for the parents, and then anything that was left over was what they got. So people often have not a very good understanding of child rearing throughout history. What happens is when we're born with a massive sense of enthusiasm and curiosity and spontaneity. And so that's very inconvenient for anybody who wants to control the child. And so constantly the child is being dissuaded from being spontaneous. Psychologically, that's explained as initially the child is living from the inside out. And eventually, because of all that external control, most of us primarily learn to live from the outside in. That is, tuning in to the nature of the environment we're living in. And so even as a teacher, you could be a very nice teacher. And for a lot of students, they're listening to you because they've learned to live from the outside in, you know, that you've got the power and they've got to listen. And then they're stuck in the process of, okay, how do I please this person who they've got to listen to? And that's, you know, in conventional education systems, is shown through exams and competition and awarding prizes for people who've listened well. The whole process of psychological recovery is very much tied up with reclaiming our spontaneity and reclaiming our ability to live from the inside out. So design is very much based, like creative design is based on living from the inside out, spontaneously and tuned in to the context and the environment in which one's operating. Whereas when we're living from the outside in, we lose awareness and we lose power, and we lose a sense of values and ethics, and often we're not in the present. We're, you know, in the past or the future. Whereas for the person, when we recover our spontaneity, we're recovering our power, our awareness, and a clarity of vision and values, and our ability to be in the present. Now, most of us are most of the time not in that spontaneous case. And so if, you know, most people will be in denial about this. So as I say this, people say, oh, no, not me, But really what you know from systems understanding is pretty much anything you see anywhere is essentially what's going on everywhere, because everything in the planet is pretty much functioning holistically. So there isn't some sort of unique thing that's so different than everything else. It's pretty much the same thing. So how we can understand this probably best is to just look at an easily accessible example of something. And for me, the really easy example of this is the supermarket. And if you look in the supermarket, there's probably about 20% of really nasty, evil sort of stuff. And there's probably about 10% of really good stuff, like healthy fruits and vegetables and bread and milk and so forth, and meat for the meat eaters. And the rest is what we would call compensatory products. So they're products that are designed to bring a little relief from misery, So breakfast cereals are a classic example. As a nutritionist said to me, he said, none of us have a need for a food that makes noise when you pour milk on it. All those breakfast cereals are products that have had nutrients removed and mostly sugar and salt and coloring and various other things added. And they're provided for convenience and for sort of sensory stimulation. Whereas, something like a muesli type breakfast is a very basic food that's been mixed up to cover all the basic nutrients. Probably 70 or 80% of what's in the supermarket is what I would call compensatory products. Mm-hmm. And there's probably about 10 to 20% that's really nasty. And there's only probably about 10% that is really good. Now, that distinction between those categories applies to everything. So it applies to what goes on in the health system, what goes on in the education system, what goes on in the political system. And the dominant thing to understand is the primary thing that's going on is substitution compensatory practices. Now, the thing to be aware of in design is that we're doing design that's concerned with the 10%. Mm. It's for the good stuff, and we're trying to stop any nasties get in there. And the harder thing is to realize that we don't need compensatories in there. We don't need things that look like they're doing something useful, but actually when you look at it very closely, they're not actually doing anything very useful. And I think that's a completely open field in permaculture. I don't see anybody's written about that in any great detail. It's sort of assumed that everything that Mollison and Holmgren and others have written is the 10%. Mm. Well, one would hope so, but it's because Holmgren and Mollison were not gods who are immune from psychological hurt and recovery. They're likely to also be to use a rather strong word, contaminated and infiltrated by things that aren't the absolute best thing. So that means that all of us have got to be awake and attentive and thinking and reflective, and also not judgmental by thinking, oh, I found something they did wrong, so they're no good. You know, it's that specific thing that needs improving, not the whole person or the whole project. So these are important lessons for us in becoming better permaculturists and designers and community people who collaborate together.
Thank you. That's very powerful. Wow, thanks.
I'll drink to that.
You drink to that.
I'm drinking kombucha as we speak, actually.
Oh, do you make it yourself?
No, I don't at the moment, but this one was actually purchased. But no, I have made kombucha, but not today.
It's funny that kombucha, because I make it, but after about 6 months, it's like, I just can't stand it. I had to go off it. And then I'm like, all right, I go back now. I have to change flavors. Maybe that would help me. I you often warned about that, not getting into patterns or habits, because it can suppress our spontaneity.
Yeah. So the opposite of spontaneity is pattern. Right. So if you recognize patterned behavior, it's a real giveaway that spontaneity is being undermined. Mm. And I noticed it particularly as a lecturer, and particularly going on a circuit giving talks that are quite often quite challenging. I'd say something challenging, and I'd just notice in the audience a whole lot of people would fold their arms like this. They didn't consciously think they were doing that, but it's a way of blocking me out, you know, of protecting themselves from these ideas which were a little bit disturbing to their comfort. Yeah, well, I think that probably means it's a bit overloading the brain. So the brain needs some support to hold it up.
Okay.
So there's lots of giveaway body language, like looking out the window. All these things are giveaways that something else is going on. And I mean, in some ways, they're saying that the person is saying, I need something else. And for the person who's blocking you out, they're needing to engage with the idea on a much smaller scale. So
at least they're being spontaneous.
Oh yeah. Well, no, I think they're being patterned.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pattern because it's not something that they're doing in just one situation. They probably do that quite often, and in fact, they probably do it when their partner's talking to them.
I don't believe it.
So.
Well, but yeah. May I ask a bit more about your term pattern, because it's quite a loaded term in permaculture. We talk about patterns, and that patterns can be useful. Is that just a different use of the term, do you think?
I think it's been misused in permaculture. The idea of having a multi-story polyculture might be seen as a pattern to think about provide enabling.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were in the Arctic, a multi-story polyculture is not the thing you're going to be looking for. So even some of those things that look like they're sacred patterns need to be reconstructed in relation to the context. And the context doesn't just involve the environment, it involves the available competencies of the people who are doing the designing. So you may have as a competent designer, have a very powerful vision for a particular thing, but that may be beyond the competence of the person who's going to have to look after it. So it may be more helpful to set up a design that's much more close to their heart, what their passion is at that moment in their situation, and see it as an evolving process that as they develop ability to engage with that particular pieces of the story, that design will evolve over time along with their changing competence. So this is the problem with gurus is, when people are set up as a guru for whatever it is, there's a tendency to think we've got to replicate what the guru does and thinks. But the guru actually had a history of being at that very preliminary stage of understanding. And that's, in a sense, what needs to be taken on is not the present competence of the guru, but the story, the journey that the guru went through or the sort of stages in that story of getting to a very profound understanding and a very well-developed ability to design and manage and so forth.
Would that be why people are quite fond of stories?
I think stories are absolutely essential as a teaching tool, and including people sharing their stories, like the students sharing their stories, is as important as the teacher sharing their stories. And having other people, guests, come in and share their stories. And I've always liked, Edward de Bono's thinking. He said, one of the ways to open our minds to other ways, he'll put forward a design, say, and he'd have everybody brainstorm what are the pluses of this design and what are the minuses of this design, and you get those all written on a piece of paper, and then he'd demonstrate grabbing that piece of paper and putting a match to it or screwing it up and throwing it in the bin. And he said, now I want you to brainstorm what are the interesting things about this design. Not the pluses and the minuses, but what's interesting about this design. And he called that PMI thinking, plus, minus, and interesting. And one of the ways to start to think out of the box about a design is to turn it upside down. Like if the roots of trees had to be in the air, what would be interesting about that? Oh, they could get more oxygen. Oh, most people don't realize that roots need to get oxygen just as much as the top part of the plant. Oh, so if roots need to get oxygen, so maybe that's why raised beds are so effective, because the oxygen can get to the roots more easily. So that whole turning things upside down can lead to enlightened thinking about things in ways that people might not have realized before. Well, you can see very quickly in a plant whether it's okay with what's happening or not. One of the things that often happens is that plants are taking up nitrogen and they're converting that nitrogen to amino acids. And then they're converting the amino acids to protein to build up the plant. Now, if they have too much nitrogen, which is what most people over-fertilize with nitrogen, even over-fertilizing with manure and organic things, the plant can't convert that amino acids to nitrogen. And that process of forming protein occurs at the tips of the plant. Now, if you look at those plants that are over-fertilized, they're always covered in aphids at those tips. You see it at the top of a broccoli plant or particularly a Brussels sprout plant, all these aphids on the tip. The insects have an incredible ability to detect plants that have got a lot of amino acids and which parts of those plants have those amino acids. Well, when you see those aphids on the tips of the plant, you then know that you've over-fertilized with nitrogen. So the plant is telling you. And in fact, Chabousseau said that every pest problem in agriculture is an over-fertilization with nitrogen problem. So it's a fairly fine-tuning process to walk that narrow line between too much and too little. But that's what an experienced gardener learns. It's a naively simple answer. It's like saying, why do you love your partner? Oh, because they're so handsome or so beautiful or whatever it is. Well, it's much, much more complex than that. It's one of the great uses of Edward de Bono's PMI is in looking at what you love about your partner is to get rid of the pluses and the minuses and actually get clearer about what the interestings are, because it's the interestings that enable you to put up with the minuses.
True.
It's not the pluses that enable you to put up with the minuses, it's the interestings.
Thank you. That's lovely. Especially when so many people have been in shutdown.
Yeah, it's been a challenge for us all.
Yeah, very interesting. Actually, I'm finding it hard to, I thought it would be hard going into the shutdown, but I'm finding it hard to get out of the shutdown.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting experience because it's part of it is knowing the things we might be going back to and knowing they're not actually what our first choice is. They're not the most interesting things.
Where's our 10%?
Yeah, exactly. So hanging on to that 10% and to be getting more aware of what that is.
What do you think your 10% is?
For me, a lot of it is just the wonders of nature, and the wonders of the human body and the whole phenomena of relationship. It's just, and the unknowing of it. Like we have some birds here that come and sit quite near to us, and you're sort of always thinking, I wonder if they like being with us, or I wonder what they're thinking, what they're getting out of being near us at this moment. And you could naively think, oh, that's because, for some people, that's because we feed them. Well, we actually don't feed the birds, but because we provide habitat for them or something. But what makes it interesting for me is not knowing, is knowing that it could be something that I am yet to discover. And particularly when a bird, comes quite close and does it every day, often, and and looks at you a certain way, you're thinking, what are they asking? How do they want me to respond? And just not knowing, and just thinking positively about them. That's the best I can do. Think, you're just so wonderful, and I'm so grateful for you coming near me at this moment. That is so amazing. And it's like, when I dig in the soil, like I spent a lot of my life doing science on the life in the soil. You see an earthworm is something that's easy to see. Well, earthworms are killed very, very quickly by ultraviolet light. So if I see an earthworm, I quickly bury it under the soil so it doesn't get affected by the ultraviolet light. Well, that's a very special relationship I have with earthworms that a lot of people wouldn't even think about. They might not even know that.
No.
Studying the life in the soil just gave me a whole other dimension to the absolute amazingness of things. And I remember it too, having this same sort of experience when I was a student growing up in England. I studied geology. And so as I traveled around, suddenly I was aware of what the underlying rocks were. And then I noticed, of course, all those old houses look different as you travel around because they were actually built with the rocks that were underneath the ground. And so that gave me a whole other understanding of landscape, the human landscape, once I understood the geology, and then how the properties of those rocks led to them eroding differently and having to be cut differently to make blocks, to make houses and so forth. Yeah, so those are the things that fascinate me. And I think equally fascinating is just my own body and my partner's body and my kid's body and our relationships, and also that whole thing of difference, constantly being aware of difference. Coming back to the Jungian preferences, one of the other distinctions is between extroverts and introverts. And one of the things that is quite common is if you have two extrovert parents and they have an introvert child, they generally are constantly thinking there's something wrong with this child, and they're constantly taking this child to the doctor saying there's something wrong with this child. And there's nothing wrong with the child. They're just different, an introvert. And the difference, particularly between introverts and extroverts, is that extroverts do a lot of their thinking externally. So they talk, they understand their thinking by talking about it. Whereas when an introvert hears something, they go inside and reflect on it. And that can take quite a long time. And if you're trying to have a conversation between an introvert and an extrovert, the extrovert is constantly wanting you to, so what do you think about this? Well, the introvert may take half an hour to think about it. It's very, very hard for an extreme extrovert to be confronted by an extreme introvert. So learning to live with those differences, which certainly is my experience with my partner, it's a wonderful thing to for me, because I'm an introvert.
Oh, are you?
In a sense, have to respond quicker than I would be normally comfortable with. So when you're asking me questions, my preference is to think about them for a long time. Well, if we're making a video, it's quite hard if I'm just sitting here in silence, going inside to think about your question. So I've learned to think a bit quicker about these things when required. That's me doing the best I can in the service of my preference, which is to spend a bit more time thinking about it inside.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that for us. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the years and decades of thinking, because I can sense it in your responses, even if you're a bit afraid of having to speak off the cuff. So thank you for that.
I'm still a bit shy.
Yeah, you still are a bit shy. So am I. The one thing that I'm always mindful of, that you remind me of, is the power of persuasion. And that's in visuals or even in the presence of a person. And sometimes persuasion can override quality of the delivery.
Yeah.
And I want to be mindful not to do that. Thank you for keeping it real.
Yeah. Well, we have to remember that Trump actually persuaded all those people to vote for him. Yeah. So there is great danger in persuasion.
But then some people need a little bit of persuasion to try to be different and to be spontaneous. Yeah. And to try new foods or to try new techniques. They need a little bit of persuasion.
The thing to put in juxtaposition to that is to engage with what I call the smallest meaningful initiative rather than somebody else's Olympic event.
Yeah.
So it needs to be personally something you're passionate about doing and can do and carry through to completion. So it's your agenda, not somebody else's agenda. And that's really important.